The following program is to provide entertainment and information. It is not considered to be any legal or investment advice. Good morning, appraisers. Let's talk some real estate. You're listening to the voice of Appraisal, the #1 appraisal podcast in America that always brings you the latest news and information from the front lines of the real estate market. Anything from market conditions, appraisal regulations, cryptocurrencies, big bank news. Folks, you have a question, we have all of your answers. We are the one-stop source for all of your real estate appraisal information needs. If you want to be on the know, you have definitely tuned in to the right show. I'm your host, Phil Crawford. Happy to have all of you here with us today. Kevin, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing good.
Good.
Just
it's been
wanted
busy.
to say to everybody out there that was waiting to hear from us last month.
Yes.
Every time I looked into Phil's office, I saw a big, huge stack of papers and just the top of his head.
Busy. And baseball. And baseball, too. Baseball, too. You know, my son's a pitcher, so that always takes up a lot of my time. Important show today, Kevin.
Yes.
Important show. Really, really important. I've been working on this show since summer of last year, and I have been researching this show for a very long time.
Right.
And we got a lot to talk about. We got a lot to talk about appraisal bias and systemic racism in the appraisal industry. So let's just get right into it. Let's just talk about appraisal bias. Let's just get into it. Let's just talk about it.
Rip the Band-Aid off.
Rip the Band-Aid off. Here we go. Appraisal bias in this country, broken down in two different sides. The first side of appraisal bias is an appraiser going out to a house and having some bias towards the people that live in the house, the people that own the house, okay? Mm-hmm. That's the first kind of bias. The second kind of bias that's been talked about in the last several years is the concept that a neighborhood would have some devaluation to it because of a redlining policy that took place on a historical level. Okay, so there's two different sides. The first one is an appraiser biased towards an individual. The second is an appraiser performing an appraisal in a systemically racial way that would impact a person because of an historical issue, such as redlining.
Their neighborhood.
Their neighborhood, exactly right. Let's just break them down. So the first situation, when you're dealing with an appraiser being biased towards a homeowner, if you are one of those kind of people, then just get the out of the business.
Yeah.
I really don't know what else to tell you. Just get the out of the business. Okay. Now, granted, the appraisal profession, I'm going to get in trouble when I said that. I'm going to get some really big trouble on this one.
What else is
new?
new?
The appraisal profession has some very interesting people in it. And when I say interesting people, I tend to think that they're not racist in the classic sense, but they're human racists. Mm-hmm. In other words, they just don't like people. And we have a lot of people in our profession that just don't like people. I mean, they're just not people. Do you see what I'm saying? And we see it all the time. I mean, I've been doing this podcast since 2014, and I have to watch the hate mail that I get because there's a lot of people out there that have a very unnatural hatred towards their fellow human beings. And it doesn't really matter what race you are or what religion you are or what color you are. They just don't like people. Mm-hmm. And we have an awful lot of them in the appraisal industry. We have more narcissists and sociopaths in this industry than, your typical batch you would have in some other industry. So that is a point that I do want to make. I'm going to get in trouble for saying it, but we all know that it's true. And if you're one of these freaks, and if you're one of these people, then get the out. Because quite honestly, I've been standing up for this profession since 2014, and I'm sick of you. I'm sick of you. You are toxic motherfuckers. You got to get out of the business. So do that sooner rather than later. Now, that's the first part of the appraisal bias situation that we have in the country. The second part, of course, has to do with the neighborhoods themselves. Would a neighborhood, because of historical redlining, have a devaluation to it? And that's what we're going to talk about today. That's the point that I want to bring up, because I started out with Dr. Perry's book, Knowing Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. I continue to do my research all the way through to 2021, into 2022, and then we recently just had the P.A.V.E. report come out. And the P.A.V.E. report stands for the Interagency Task Force on Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity. This was the task force that was formed after President Biden's executive order that he signed the very first day he was in office. Okay, and I covered this on a podcast a few years ago. So the P.A.V.E. report came out, and when it did, there was a special presentation that was done. And the presentation had Vice President Harris, it had the White House Domestic Policy Advisor Susan Rice, and it had the Housing and Urban Development Secretary, Marcia Fudge. During this presentation, when they came out with the P.A.V.E. report, they interviewed some homeowners that felt that they were discriminated against by real estate appraisers. And that's what I want to concentrate on. That's the big thing. Because when the homeowners feel that they're discriminated against, that bothers me.
Right.
That gets me upset. And I want to know exactly what happened in all these cases. One thing that we as real estate appraisers tend to forget, and we need to remind ourselves about this all the time, and I remind my kids about this all the time, no matter what, is property is an inalienable right. We tend to forget that as Americans because the Declaration of Independence always has life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because TJ didn't really steal John Locke's life, liberty, and property as he should have. Mm-hmm. When he wrote that document to King George, he should have said, we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, which are life, liberty, property, for the pursuit of happiness. Property is an inalienable right. We value an inalienable right. And when you get down to it, when you get down to life, liberty, and property, those become very, very emotional to people. And we tend to forget that as real estate appraisers. You know, we're valuing this treasure of earth, and people do like their treasures of earth. But property at the end of the day is power. And if you do not have property, then you do not have power within a society. It's as simple and easy as that. What is a king, Kevin? What is a queen? All they are is nothing but a big, fat f***ing landlord. That's all they are. And they have all these little landlord friends. And the little landlord friends, they give all these special titles to, like Duke and Duchesses and Knights and Earls and all this bullshit, when all they are is nothing but a landlord. And that's it. When you see these individuals during this P.A.V.E. report presentation, you're seeing 5 American citizens who have the right of property. And you have to be able to understand that that is sacred. Property rights are sacred. Without that one inalienable right, life and liberty don't matter. Look at 6,000 years of recorded human history. If you don't have property rights, your life and your liberty are gone immediately. So what I tell my children and what I teach my children all the time is that property is power. And the more you have it and the more equity you have in it, the more power you have. And I think real estate appraisers tend to forget that. We appraise so much property all the time, we forget the sacred part of it and how important that is. Now, during this conversation, one of the individuals that was part of the presentation brought up something that really stood out to me. And as soon as he said this, it made me think about Dr. Andre Perry's book. So, Kevin, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get into some sound bites inside of the P.A.V.E. report presentation. And what I want to discuss is what some of the participants said and how that attributes to this concept of a devaluation in certain neighborhoods and what the problem would be with the sales comparison approach. So remember, the sales comparison approach right now is under the microscope as far as valuation is concerned. So let's listen to what this gentleman has to say about the sales comparison approach. Go ahead.
One of the things going in I knew was that I needed to ensure that I had comps. So I went out and did research, connected with the realtor to ensure that I had comparables in the marketplace.
It's the new house he's buying.
What's interesting, though, one of the things obviously appraisals uses within a certain mile radius. The challenge with that is you're in an entire area that's undervalued. Your comps are going to be undervalued. So it was incumbent upon me then to go outside of that immediate area and go to another market, a neighboring county, and was then able to pull comps that I then provided to the appraiser. Even with that, though, that was a challenge. Even with the additional comps, the value did not come in where I anticipated it should have come in or near our cost.
Okay, so he has a statement there that's very interesting. He says,
you're in an entire area that's undervalued, your comps are going to be undervalued.
Bingo. So see, he says at that time, if you're in an entire area that's been undervalued on a historical level, then your comparables will be undervalued.
Right.
So that is the concept of a disagreement with the sales comparison approach in its traditional manner. You see what I'm saying, Kevin? Mm-hmm. So in other words, if you were an appraiser and you had to break that down into appraiser terms, how would you break it down? You would break it down and say that there are certain properties in this country that have a level of devaluation, is what I've heard. Devaluation is what Andre Perry uses in his book. I would consider it to be depreciation. Mm-hmm. So there is some level, because of historical and present racial and discriminatory practices, there is some level of depreciation on certain property in this country. Now, the depreciation is not physical, functional, or external, because that all has to deal with the house itself, with the structure itself. The depreciation is something deeper than that. The depreciation goes down to the land level. Now, 100% of the time, appraisers are always told and taught that land does not depreciate, that there is no depreciation of land. However, if you take this point of view, that there is a devaluation, then, in fact, there is a depreciation on land. And how would you call that depreciation? You would call that depreciation a social depreciation. A social depreciation of land based on past and present racial and discriminatory practices. Something that society did in that location caused an impact of depreciation. Remember, depreciation is a loss in value for any reason whatsoever. What if the reason happens to be society itself? What if society caused that depreciation? That's how an appraiser would approach that situation. What would you call that? You would call that a social depreciation. A social depreciation of land based on past and present racial and discriminatory practices, specifically redlining. Go to redlining, then that creates an appraisal bias inside the data set, and therefore you have to ask yourself as an appraiser, is that depreciation curable or is it incurable? If you read Dr. Perry's book, at the moment, that depreciation, that the level of depreciation is in an incurable position. What the hearings in the Senate and in Congress were designed to do is to see if there would be some curability within that social depreciation of land. Now, you guys have never heard of this before. You've never taken a class in the appraisal industry where you sit down, you talk about historical redlining and the impacts of historical redlining that could end up being a social depreciation on land. The reason why I've never heard about it is because our leadership sucks. We don't get around and we don't sit around on a higher level and discuss these issues. Instead, like a bunch of cult members, we get together every 2 years on our 7-hour USPAP and wonder about what the Appraisal Foundation changed this year. What little word did they change? Or what little definition did they put in, instead of having these really, really deep conversations about society itself? So when he said that, that really made me think that is the position that we need to look at. Then what ended up happening is after that was over with, after the P.A.V.E. report was done, after the presentation was done, then the Senate had their hearing and the House had their hearing. Now, the Senate hearing you can listen to. The one thing I noticed about that hearing, Kevin, was there wasn't a lot of senators there. Mm-hmm. You know, usually you would see more and more senators, on site and in these hearings. But I noticed that there wasn't a lot of senators. But it was the House hearing that really got me intrigued. And the person I thought did the best presentation in the hearing was Lisa Rice. Lisa Rice is with the National Fair Housing Alliance. And we're going to, do a lot of sound bites on her because she really gets into this concept of a social depreciation of land based on a past and present racial and discriminatory practice within society. We're going to do a lot of sound bites on her, but I want you guys to get your head around that right now. That's why you're seeing a lot of arguments out there saying that the sales comparison approach is inaccurate. The sales comparison approach has built-in bias. And because most of the algorithms in the country today, most of the so-called, AVM algorithms, they use that kind of data. The collateral underwriter over at Fannie Mae, I'm sure, uses that kind of data, especially when it generates a CU score, collateral underwriter score. So there is this concept that there is this racial bias built in to all of the data sets because of the sales comparison approach. I want you guys to get your head around that because that is the position that a lot of people are taking. So get your head around that, and now let's go ahead and listen to a couple of the sound bites from Lisa Rice from the National Fair Housing Alliance. Okay, what Lisa wants to do, this is very, very important, is she is advocating for a national valuation list. In other words, all of the agencies working together to create a national valuation catalog of all the residential properties in the United States. Let's go ahead and listen to her soundbite from the House hearing.
To improve research, compliance, and enforcement, Congress should encourage the regulators to immediately enter into a data sharing agreement and should provide the CFPB with rulemaking authority to develop a public valuation database.
Public valuation database. Not Zillow, by the way.
No.
Not
another Zillow.
Not another Zillow. No, because remember, Zillow is based on, that algorithm is based on the sales comparison approach, right? What is sold in the area. So therefore, there probably has some systemic level of bias in that data.
Right.
Okay. So what Ms. Rice is talking about here is creating a national database of residential real estate values and property. But how is she going to do it? How is she going to do it? That's the big question. That's what everybody's talking about. Are you going to use the sales comparison approach? Do you use the cost approach? Do you use the income approach? what is the best way to do this?
Now, my question is, being a layperson,
sure,
why wasn't this done years ago?
Well, okay, so Ms. Rice used to work in the insurance side. Okay, so on the insurance side, what they found out was there was a lot of bias in insurance agents when it came to establishing premiums. So what they did was they took away the quote-unquote art form of creating a premium for an insurance company and turned it more into a science. Okay, so they created a universal way of producing an insurance quote. Ms. Rice is taking that same philosophy and now taking it over to the real estate appraisal side. So in essence, what she's advocating for is a form of universal basic valuation. Not universal basic income. Don't get confused. Universal basic valuation. That's going to be away from the traditional sales comparison approach that you and I have always dealt with throughout the last 25 years of our career. So universal basic valuation. Now, is this going to match up with the banking system? Is this going to match up with FHFA? Is it going to match up? No, it's not going to match up at all. As a matter of fact, all the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac give a damn about is the what? The sales comparison approach, right? That's all they care about. I myself am big into the income approach, but that's the concept. And I think a lot of appraisers out there are so they're bitter and they're upset because they're saying, well, don't people understand what we do? We pull comps and we pull the closest and we pull the most recent and da-da. They understand that and they have a problem with it because the problem is that the comparables that are used could have the same societal depreciation as your house and they should not be used. Do you see what I'm saying? So there has to be a different way. Andre Perry, during the presentation that the Appraisal Foundation and the Appraisal Institute put on just recently, where it was a symposium, Andre Perry specifically said, find another way. Find another way to value property. As a matter of fact, he offered $1 million award if you found another way. $1 million award if you found a way to universal basic valuation. That's what Ms. Rice is talking about. Let's go and break down some more sound bites at first. She addresses the issues of algorithms. Now, you know as well as I do that I have a big problem with AVMs. I have a problem with AVM algorithms. I think they're ridiculous. Let's listen to what Ms. Rice has to say about algorithms.
Ms. Rice, unconscious bias is pervasive throughout so many different aspects of mortgage and lending process. And I don't know which one is best. On one is you do the AVMs.
AVMs.
Is more one is prescriptive, and the other one is more algorithm driven. What's best? Because I could see abuses in both. Well, how would you? What would?
I worked on a case a number of years ago in which a judge opined that appraising was an art and not a science.
See that? Yeah.
And the art is where we move the field away from being more discretionary and having a lot of subjectivity in the process to one that is more scientific, more uniform, more standardized. The algorithm-based systems can be problematic because they are using data that has bias embedded and baked into the data.
See what I'm saying? Boom, right there, yeah.
Help.
See, so in other words, she's saying that she wants to move towards more of a universal valuation process that won't have the bias built into the data.
And like she also said, to your point, she wants to get away from the artsy.
The art side of it. That's the subjectivity. The subjectivity of it, which would come from an appraiser or in the past, it came from insurance people as well. So we're going to listen to Ms. Rice. Now, this next soundbite is very important because this talks about the issue of redlining, the history of redlining, the damage that redlining did. Now, remember, you're going to hear redlining and appraisal bias together going forward from this point on.
Right.
So redlining causes appraisal bias in this position. Go ahead and let's get to the soundbite that Ms. Rice is talking about.
So we cannot separate the rampant appraisal bias against black homeowners from our nation's history of segregation and redlining. When establishing a property's value, appraisers use comparable sales of similar properties in that neighborhood.
Right.
However, they often select lower value comparable sales in black and minority neighborhoods, leading to undervalued appraisals. Ms. Rice, even if appraisers use appropriate comparable sales, can you tell us how historical discriminatory practices such as redlining are baked into current property values, perpetuating the impact of past discrimination today?
Okay, so here it is. And
what redlining does, thank you first First of all, Congresswoman Presley, for the question. What redlining does, both lending redlining and insurance redlining does, is it causes a restriction of competition in the market. So you have a decreased number of transactions, you have a decreased number of players in those communities, and some of those communities don't have access to lending or insurance products at all. And so when you rob a community of competition, you're automatically deflating valuations in those communities because you're not supporting the demand that otherwise could be there.
Upon that, Ms. Rice, how do these compounding effects of low appraisals in a community, how do they dampen a neighborhood, reducing the realized wealth of all homeowners who live there?
Right. Well, because the way that appraisals are done in the residential space, the sales comparison approach, in order to assess the property value for your subject property, you've got to rely on values of adjacent properties in that community.
In the banking system.
Where the subject property is located. And so if all of the values, or if even some of the values of those properties upon which you're relying for your comparables are deflated, are artificially deflated,
depreciated,
that is going to result in a deflation of the value for your subject property.
Yep, there it is. See?
You cut that too, depreciated.
Depreciated. So she's saying devalued or deflated. She's using the word deflated. I'm using the word, as an appraiser, depreciated.
Right.
Social depreciation of what? Of the land based on past and present racial and discriminatory practices from society.
Right.
That's the concept.
Now,
and that's something that we need to discuss.
So, Phil?
Yes.
Looking at these concepts,
yes.
What do you think the banking system would say about
it? They're going to disagree with it. They're going to disagree, and that's the big issue, because we don't have the soundbite. But one of the things that Ms. Rice said during her testimony is that you're going to have to change the system. I mean, if you're going to get into something deep like this, where we're looking at a level of societal depreciation on certain property in the country today, then you're going to have to change the entire system. You're going to have to change a multi-trillion-dollar system. Now, I want to get that out there. A multi-trillion-dollar trillion-dollar system. And do you think in a multi-trillion-dollar system that 33,000 appraisers are going to have an impact on that? We don't have the impact that people think we do. We just report the data, but we do it in a manner to which we've been trained. But there's three approaches to value, Kevin. There's three approaches to value. In the sales comparison approach, it's one, but it's not the only one. But the secondary market always considers it to be the only one. These days, when I value property, especially as an investor, sales comparison approach, I'm looking for the income off the property. You have to understand something. After 2008, single-family residential property became a Tier 1 asset with hedge funds. A Tier 1 asset, which means that they're buying property because of the rental income off of it. So if you have a property in an area and the sales comparison approach is giving you an accurate value, the income approach will give you a pretty damn good accurate value.
Right.
So, I mean, it is one of those things to consider and look at, because income is everything. The interest rates have been so low. They've gone to negative so much. I've been talking about the income approach for years. Do you have the American Enterprise? Do you have that? Do you have the soundbite from 2019? Yeah. American Enterprise Institute, 2019. This is Phil Crawford talking to Dougie Doug Duncan over at Fannie Mae and Frank the Tank over at CoreLogic. Listen to this.
Mr. Duncan, you are on fire.
Yeah.
Because from Fannie Mae, you have brought up two awesome points. Number one, I'm going to extinguish him, right? Yeah,
he's on fire, guys. Extinguish him. Go ahead.
Number one, you brought up negative interest rates.
Yeah, back when it was negative interest rates.
Real estate appraisers are concentrating on. It's in Europe. It's in Japan. It's in Germany. It's driving our 10-year Treasury down. It's driving mortgage rates down. Alan Greenspan recently came out and said that there's no zero barrier when it comes to interest rates.
Well, we're paying for that shit, aren't we?
Are looking at that seriously.
We're paying for it now. Look at the inflation we have.
I think in the next 12 months, you're on fire with that. So, Frank, you're on fire.
Here's Frank.
Because you just explained me as a single-family investor in Cincinnati, Ohio. And as rents get higher and higher, and Miss Molly, you're looking for rental data. As rents get higher and higher, It's not going to be about the sales comparison anymore. It's going to be about the rental income. People are going to buy homes because of the rents that's generated off them. 3 approaches to value: sales comparison, cost, and income. And the income may be the most predominant way to value property in the future, okay? That's all I got to say. Thank you very much for allowing us to come out.
Right there, 2019.
3 years ago.
3 years ago before coronavirus. I was sitting next to Lori Noble back then. Income approach. The income approach is that, look, when you deal with investors, when you deal with big investors, the neo-feudalistic investors that are going to probably try to take over half the neighborhoods in the country anyways, when you're dealing with that, they're looking at the income. What can be derived off of the income?
Right.
So if you look at property throughout all of the country, base it on an income approach if you want to. But the big banks are not going to look at that. The big banks are still going to use what could be this old sales comparison approach.
The crap.
It could be. And if it does prove itself out to be the approach that is not necessarily appropriate for residential property, then we as real estate appraisers need to talk about that. So I hear everybody out there. I was just quoted in the New York Times just recently about these desktop products. This is going to cure this, and this is going to cure that. You're still using the sales comparison approach.
Right.
But you have to have the bigger discussion in this. Does the sales comparison approach have a systemic form of social depreciation from past and present racial and discriminatory practices? And is that social depreciation curable or incurable? And if it is incurable, then what can we do as a society to cure it? That's the big question that you have to ask. And I am sorry for those of you out there that have felt like you've been discriminated against or had bias put against you from the appraisal profession because our leadership sucks. They can't get together and have these conversations on a higher level that could change things in a positive way. Instead, we sit around for 2 years and talk about the USAPAPA, the almighty USAPAPA.
The ring.
The USAPAPA ring. And the one thing Ms. Rice also brought up, and we have a soundbite on it, but I'm not going to play it, is that she wanted to talk about having national licensing, which I think may actually be a pretty decent idea considering the fact that all of these local boards and all the 55 jurisdictions interpret that cult-like document 1,500 different ways. They weaponize it.
Exactly.
They weaponize it. They keep people out of the business. They've done it in different states throughout the country. They just did it in West Virginia. West Virginia just recently, the legislators in West Virginia had to pass a law saying that you couldn't use your interpretation of USPAP to keep somebody from getting their license. Can you believe that? It's the weaponization of USPAP. So this is what we do. We have human racists weaponizing USPAP. We have people out there not smart enough to handle a discussion like this to get into history and say, okay, maybe there is an issue here that we need to address as a society and do it in a responsible manner. Instead, we just have a bunch of emotional shit flying all over the place.
Now, what I want to say in closing, Phil, is...
Yes, Kevin, yes.
Just for everybody out there, yeah, this is going to tick some people off. Some people are going to be like, hey, he's spot on. Whatever he said this whole show, he has been right there. Other people are going to be mad. They're going to be angry. They're
defensive.
They're going to be They're going to want to be keyboard warriors.
Oh yeah,
just blow up the email.
Oh yeah.
All I ask is re-listen to this show with an open mind.
Open mind. It's a position that needs to be looked at. And it's a discussion that needs to be had every 2 years in this industry in fair housing classes, so we can continue forward as a profession and be a viable part of the ecosphere that we work in every single day. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our show for this week. And as always, I would like to thank you for listening. As we journey through the mysteries and complexities that are, in fact, the appraisal business, I would like to thank my producer, Kevin Kinney, for being here, for his thoughtful insight and knowledge. And thank you for all the hard work on the sound bites, Kevin. God willing, we're going to be back here very soon, continuing to report from the front lines of the real estate market. In the meantime, you kiss your spouse, you hug your children, enjoy your day, be safe in the field. You've been listening to Phil Crawford on Voice of Appraisal. We'll talk very soon.